The sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot broke the silence of the forest. Each step was a warning crackle in a world that had forgotten how to trust. The wind sliced through the skeletal trees of an occupied Poland, where even the cold seemed to have chosen a side in the war. There, in a small village far from the cities and front lines, lived Stanislaw, a modest farmer with tired eyes, calloused hands, and a soul weighed down by all he had witnessed. He wasn't a hero, nor a villain, just a man trying to survive. One more winter, one more day under the boot of history. The year was 1943. The Nazis had long seized control of the region. Soldiers passed through the village often enough to remind people they weren't free, but not so frequently as to seem omnipresent. The villagers learned to live in between fear and routine, hunger and harvest, silence and secrets. Stanislaw had a wife who barely spoke anymore, a son who played with stones because toys were a luxury, and a barn that moaned at night like it remembered better days. One morning, just before the sun cracked the horizon, a knock came at his door. 3 short raps. Not the careless knock of a traveler asking for directions, nor the urgent pounding of soldiers. It was cautious, measured, human. Stanislaw opened the door slowly, and there she was, no more than 10 years old. Her coat was oversized, probably borrowed or stolen, and her face was pale as snow. Dark hair clung to her forehead. Her lips trembled, not from the cold, but from fear. In her hands a piece of bread, half-eaten, gripped like a treasure. She looked up at him with eyes that didn't beg. "They pleaded. I'm sorry," she said in a whisper, "but they're close. Please." Stanislaw didn't move. His heart did. It raced ahead of his thoughts. He knew. There was no doubt in his mind. The shape of her face, the name she hadn't given, the fear she didn't need to explain. She was Jewish, and someone was hunting her. Behind him, his wife had stepped into the hallway. She said nothing, only stared. Their son remained asleep, a blanket twisted around his legs like roots trying to hold him in dreams. Stanislaw knew the rules. Everyone did. Helping a Jew wasn't just illegal, it was fatal. Entire families had been executed for less. The Nazis didn't care if it was a child. They didn't care if you'd only given a glass of water. If they found out, there'd be no trial, no mercy. Just a bullet in the head, or worse. And yet, in that moment, with the wind howling behind her and death waiting just beyond the tree line, he didn't think about the law. He thought about his son. He imagined that boy, his boy alone, freezing, hunted, and he wondered, if roles were reversed, if some stranger opened their door one day and saw his son standing there, what would they do? He stepped aside. She didn't cry. She didn't thank him. She simply entered, her little legs carrying her. Past him as though her body had made the decision long before her mind dared to believe it. Stanislaw's wife turned and walked back into the kitchen, saying nothing. The silence was not consent, but it also wasn't refusal. That was enough. The next few hours were a blur. They fed her what little soup remained from last night's dinner. She sat near the fire, barely speaking, just watching the flames, as though they might consume her memories if she stared hard enough. Her name, she finally said, was Hannah. She had been with a group, but they were separated. She didn't know where her parents were now. She didn't ask to stay. She only said she couldn't go back outside. Not yet. Stanislaw knew they couldn't. Keep her in the house. The neighbors might see, children talk. Rumors are currency during wartime, and betrayal buys safety. So when night came, he led her to the barn. It wasn't warm, but it was shelter. He cleared out a space beneath the hay and gave her an old blanket. As he tucked it around her, she looked up and asked, "Do you think I'll die?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he said, "Stay quiet. Don't light anything. Don't move if you hear voices." She nodded once, then lay down as if she'd done this before. Back inside the house, his wife was waiting, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp. "You know what this means?" she said. "I do." "If they find her..." "I know." She didn't argue. Instead, she asked, "Do you remember the Nowaks?" Everyone remembered the Nowaks, a family like theirs, gone overnight. No one had ever seen their bodies, but everyone knew. They had hidden 2 brothers in their cellar. Someone told the Germans. The brothers were dragged into the street and shot. The Nowaks simply disappeared. No trial, no explanation. Their house was burned, their names erased from the village, like chalk from a board. "We're not them," Stanislaw said, unsure whether he meant it as a reassurance or a denial. For 3 days, Hannah stayed hidden. Stanislaw brought her food at dawn and dusk, always in secret. His son asked questions. "Why is there less soup today?" But children learn quickly not to ask too much during war. On the 4th day, soldiers came. They weren't the usual. Patrol. These ones were different. Taller, harder, with eyes that didn't blink as often. Their boots were polished. One of them wore a coat with medals. The officer. They knocked, but it wasn't a question. Stanislaw opened the door with a smile he had learned to wear like a mask. "Routine inspection," the officer said in German accented Polish. "There are rumors." "Rumors?" Stanislaw asked, feigning ignorance. "Jews. In this area. Some. Say a girl." Stanislaw's heart dropped into his stomach. He felt it sink, felt the blood leave his fingertips. "I haven't seen anyone," he said. The officer nodded. "We'll see." They searched the house first. Every room. His wife watched silently, her hands shaking only once when they opened the wardrobe. Their son sat at the table, pretending to draw, though the pencil trembled in his grip. Then they moved to the barn. Stanislaw walked with them, each step like a countdown. He had hidden her well. But what if she moved? What if she cried? What if... "They brought dogs?" One of the soldiers poked around in the hay. Another climbed the loft. The officer paced slowly, almost leisurely. Then he stopped. Something on the floor. A scuff mark. A loose pile of straw. He turned to Stanislaw and smiled. "Cold nights," he said. "Animals like to burrow." Stanislaw said nothing. He couldn't speak through the storm in his chest. After what felt like hours, they left. Back. In the house, his wife wept for the first time in months. His son sat in silence, and Stanislaw, now fully aware of the edge they stood on, returned to the barn. She was still there, still alive, still watching the fire in her mind. He didn't say anything. He just sat beside her and breathed. Every day after the soldiers left, the silence in the village became louder. It wasn't just the absence of boots on gravel or the shouts from patrols. It was the silence of people pretending nothing had happened. Eyes averted. Conversations shortened. Fear was no longer shouted in alleys. It was whispered in kitchens, folded into bread dough and tucked behind curtains. And in that silence, Hannah breathed. She hadn't said much since the search. She stayed in her corner of the barn between stacks of hay and old tools, reading a tattered book Stanislaw had given her, one his son had outgrown. It was missing pages, but she didn't mind. She filled the gaps with her own imagination. Every once in a while she would look up as if she heard something no one else could. Perhaps it was memory. Perhaps it was warning. Stanislaw had never known how long a day could stretch when you were hiding someone who shouldn't exist. Every cough from a neighbor made him flinch. Every creak of a wagon wheel sounded like a verdict. He had become a prisoner in his own home, chained to a choice that could destroy everything he loved. And yet, there was no regret, only fear and a question that gnawed at his soul. How long could they keep this up? Some nights he would wake, drenched in sweat, thinking he heard boots at the door, only to find it was the wind nudging loose shutters. His wife had stopped singing in the kitchen. His son no longer played with the wooden soldier he once carried everywhere. Even the animals sensed the change. The hens clucked nervously, and the dog had stopped barking altogether. The whole house held its breath. One morning, while tending to the field with his son, he noticed something unusual. A bicycle leaning against a tree. No one rode bicycles anymore, not with the war, not with soldiers around, and certainly not toward his farm without a reason. He told his son to go inside and pretend to be sick. Then he waited. Minutes later, a man emerged from the woods. He wore a worn-out coat and carried a satchel slung over his shoulder. His face was lined not by age but by tension, and his eyes scanned the horizon like a soldier, even though he didn't wear a uniform. He wasn't German. That much Stanislaw could tell. "Are you Stanislaw?" the man asked softly. Stanislaw said nothing. Silence was safer than lies. The man reached into his satchel slowly, carefully, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it over. Stanislaw hesitated, then took it. The handwriting was childlike, jagged, familiar. It was from Hannah. She was with us, the man said. "There were 15 of us. Now there are 3. She ran when the dogs came. We thought she was dead." Stanislaw read the short message, just a few words. "If you found me, thank you. If they found me, I'm sorry." "She's alive," Stanislaw said quietly. The man's breath caught. For a second, the tension in his shoulders loosened. Then it returned. "You can't keep her here. It's too dangerous. They're searching again. They shot a family last week in the town nearby." Stanislaw nodded. "I know." The man looked at him carefully, reading something deeper than words. "You've already made your choice, haven't you?" "I did the moment I opened the door." The man reached into his coat again and handed Stanislaw a small folded map. "There's a place. 20 kilometers north, forest, old chapel, no roof. We use it to regroup. We can take her there, safely." "When?" "Tonight. But she has to walk. No lights, no sound." Stanislaw folded the paper, slipped it into his pocket, and turned toward the barn. That evening, he sat with Hannah, watching her sip soup from a tin cup. Her hand still trembled slightly, though not from cold. "There's someone here," he said. "Someone who knows you." Her eyes lit up for the first time since she'd arrived. It was like watching a candle flicker in a storm. Fragile, but alive. "He says he can take you somewhere safer." She looked down at her soup, then back at him. "Will I be alone?" "No, there will be others." "Will you come?" "No," he said gently. "This is where I have to stay." Her lips pressed into a line. She didn't cry, she didn't protest, she just nodded. That night, just past midnight, they dressed her in layers, every scrap of clothing they could find, without raising suspicion. Stanislaw wrapped bread in cloth and tucked it into her coat. His wife braided her hair quickly, whispering, something no one else heard. A blessing, perhaps. A goodbye. At the edge of the woods, the man waited with another figure, shorter, maybe another child. Stanislaw and Hannah walked together in silence, the frost crunching underfoot like thin glass. At the tree line, they stopped. Hannah turned to him. Her lips parted, but no words came, so he spoke first. "Remember the fire, not the cold. The warmth, not the fear." She nodded, and then she was gone. Stanislaw stood there long after they disappeared. He didn't return to the house until the first light broke the horizon. His wife was waiting by the window. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Days passed, then a week. The village held its breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No soldiers came, no shouts, just winter. And then one day a letter, no name on the envelope, no stamp, just a scrap of paper tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the barn. Stanislaw unfolded it with shaking hands. It was Hannah's handwriting again. "Thank you, I made it. There were others. We are hiding, but we are warm. I still remember your soup. And the fire. I will remember it forever." He sat down in the hay, the letter crumpled in his hands, and wept. But not from fear, from hope. Hope that maybe, in the darkest moments, doing the right thing wasn't just survival, it was resistance. A way to fight without bullets, a way to reclaim a sliver of humanity from the machine of war. That evening he walked through the fields as dusk swallowed the horizon, thinking of her steps echoing in the dark woods. He wondered if she'd look back. He wondered if she remembered the smell of hay, the creak of the barn door, the way his wife had brushed the dust from her shoulder like a mother would. He hoped so. Because when the world forgets you, all you have left is memory, and for now that would have to be enough. The cold had settled into their bones now. It was no longer a question of feeling the chill. It lived in them, shaped their days and slowed their movements. In the trenches, frost clung to metal, mud turned to brittle stone, and every breath became a silent prayer against the wind. There was no comfort, only routine, and even that was borrowed. Letters. They were the only thing that still felt real. They came folded, smudged, often torn from months on the road, carried by tired hands, and worn bags. But to a soldier, they weighed more than bullets. Letters were proof that someone somewhere remembered them, that their name still had weight, that their story wasn't over. That morning, the postman arrived late, not by his fault. He had been caught under artillery fire the day before, hidden in a ditch for hours. Yet he arrived, uniform stained with dirt, fingers trembling, eyes red. He didn't speak. He just handed out what he had, one name at a time, like distributing fragments of forgotten hope. My friend Eric stood beside me, his eyes fixed on the bag. He hadn't received a letter in weeks. He'd stopped saying it aloud, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the silent hope curled into every breath. The names were called Kowalski, Berger, Franz, not his. He looked down, swallowed hard, and turned to leave, but then the postman called his name, Eric Vogel. He froze. The paper was folded neatly, tied with a piece of twine. Eric took it in both hands as though it might break if touched too quickly. He didn't open it there. None of us did. That was sacred. A letter was something you read in solitude, away from gunpowder and noise. Later, after roll call, I found him sitting near a broken wall away from the others. His eyes were wet. Not with sorrow, but something more painful. Confusion. "It's from my wife," he said. I nodded. Of course it was. She wrote about the garden, said the apples are late this year, that the river behind the mill froze over in October. He looked at the letter again, hands trembling. But she never mentions my name? Not once. I frowned. Maybe she was rushing, or scared it might be read? He nodded slowly, but I could tell that answer didn't satisfy him. Days passed, and the cold deepened. Food rations were cut again. The war wasn't going well, though none of us were told that directly. We could feel it in the silence of the officers, in the way the maps were folded away quicker than usual. Eric didn't speak much after that. He still kept the letter in his pocket, touched it now and then like a charm. But he looked over his shoulder more often, as if he'd left something behind, as if the words on that page had shaken something loose inside him. One night, during watch, he turned to me and whispered, "Do you think she still loves me?" The question hung in the air between us, heavier than the rifle I held. "I don't." "No," I said. Because the truth was, I didn't. It wasn't just the battles we fought here. There were wars happening back home too. People changed. Time bent them. What felt eternal before became uncertain. Love wasn't a fortress. It was a candle in a wind tunnel, but I wanted to believe. So I added, "But she wrote. That means something." He nodded, but his eyes said otherwise. 2 weeks later, a new letter arrived. This time it wasn't addressed to Eric. It was for me. And inside a small note from my sister. She said our village had been shelled, that the neighbors were gone, that the bakery, where we used to buy bread every Sunday, had been reduced to ash. She mentioned our old dog Mika had died. She said my father no longer spoke much, just sat by the window staring at the empty road. But at the bottom, a single line stood out. Eric's wife left. 4 words. No explanation. Just that. I held the letter in my hand for a long time, unsure what to do. Do I tell him? Do I let him carry the illusion, the thread that's keeping him upright? That night, we sat beside the fire barrel, sharing a scrap of meat. Eric spoke about a dream he had. He was in his garden, holding his wife's hand, watching their son chase ducks by the river. He laughed as he spoke, laughed in a way I hadn't heard in months, and I realized something cruel. Hope is a form of pain too, because it delays the collapse. I didn't tell him, not that night, not the next, and then it was too late. We were ordered to move at dawn. The next post was deeper in the woods, closer to the front, the kind of place where letters wouldn't reach, where names stopped mattering, just numbers, positions, coordinates. During the march, we were shelled. Mortars fell like lightning. In the chaos, men scattered. I remember grabbing Eric's coat, trying to pull him behind a ridge, but he pushed me away. I dropped the letter. He shouted, and before I could stop him, he ran back. He was gone before the next blast hit. We found him an hour later. He was curled beside a crater, body broken, hand outstretched toward a scrap of paper fluttering in the mud. It was unreadable. The ink had bled. I buried him myself, behind the ridge, beneath a fallen tree. I placed the letter in his pocket, the one she had written, the one without his name, because even if it wasn't perfect, even if it was a lie, it was his. And sometimes in war, lies are all we have to cling to. Later that week, I wrote to his wife, told her he died a hero, that his last words were her name. Don't know if she ever read it, I never heard back, but I hope she did, because the truth would have been too heavy to carry, for her, for me. Sometimes silence is mercy. There are things that war cannot touch, fleeting things, a smell from home, a lullaby, the curve of a signature. But voices are different. They echo even in silence. They linger when the person is gone. That's how it was with Daniel. He wasn't the strongest among us, nor the bravest, but his voice, it could carve through the smoke and the fear like sunlight breaking through a shuttered window. He had this deep, calm tone, like the earth itself had lent him its weight. When Daniel spoke, you listened, not because he demanded it, but because you needed to. He'd been a teacher before the war. History, I think. The kind of man who could turn even the most boring story into something that made your heart race. In the trenches, he used that gift. At night, when we huddled together in the dark, listening for enemy boots or incoming shells, he told us stories. Not heroic tales, no grand speeches, just memories. One night, with the rain tapping like fingers against our helmets, he spoke of his wife, said her name was Lisa, that she had a laugh that made neighbors stop and smile. He described the way she used to hum when she cooked, how she'd forget where she left her keys but always remembered everyone's birthday. Simple things, beautiful things. He spoke of her as if she were right there, standing beside him. And, for a moment, we believed it. We needed to. The next morning we were ambushed. It was quick, brutal. Gunfire ripped through the fog. Men screamed. Orders flew like birds caught in a storm. I remember diving into the mud, hearing someone cry out behind me. When it ended, we had lost 3 men. Daniel was among them. At least we thought so. We found his helmet in the field, blood near it. No sign of him. For hours we searched. Then, just before dusk, someone heard a voice. Faint. Croaking. It was Daniel. He was in a crater, half buried under debris, one arm broken, chest pierced by shrapnel. But he was alive, barely. When we carried him back, he kept whispering her name. Lisa, Lisa, Lisa. I sat beside him that night, holding his hand. He was cold, shaking. His eyes couldn't focus. But still, he spoke. He told me about the day they met. She dropped a book in the market. He picked it up. Their fingers touched. She smiled. That was it. He said he never believed in fate until that moment. I asked him if he wanted me to write to her. He nodded. So I did. I took out a scrap of paper and wrote everything he said, word for word. He dictated it like a prayer, his voice trembling but sure. He told her he wasn't afraid, that even in the mud, even surrounded by death, he felt her presence. That her love had been his shield, his warmth, his reason, he told. Her, he would dream of her smile until his last breath. I finished the letter, folded it, promised to send it. He smiled, and then he died. Quietly, like a candle going out. The next day, I handed the letter to the courier, told him it was urgent, but the front was collapsing. Roads were blocked, rail lines bombed. The letter never made it. A week later, I received word from a medic station. They had intercepted a call from civilian lines. A woman named Lisa had been looking for news. Any news? She hadn't heard from her husband in months. I asked to speak to her. They patched the line, and for the first time since I left home, I heard a voice from beyond the trenches. Clear, soft, familiar. "Hello?" she said. I didn't know what to say at first. Then I told her who I was, that I had been with Daniel, that he had spoken of her until the very end. I read the letter aloud. She didn't interrupt, didn't cry, just breathed. When I finished, there was silence, and then she said, "Thank you." I asked if she was all right. She said, "No, but I will be." We spoke for a few more minutes. She asked if he suffered. I told her no, that he went peacefully. It was a lie, but a kind one. Before hanging up, she said something I'll never forget. "You gave me back his voice." That stayed with me, because in war you lose so much. People, places, time. But losing a voice, that's losing a part of yourself. After that call, I began collecting voices. Every man I met, every comrade, I asked them to tell me something. About home, about someone they loved, about who they were before all this, and I wrote it down in a notebook made from scavenged paper, page after page of memories. A farmer missing his daughter's first steps, a student writing poems for the girl he never dared to approach, a baker dreaming of opening his own shop, all of them, voices, and when they died, and so many did, I read their words aloud, not for them, but for us, so we wouldn't forget who they had been. One evening I sat beside a new recruit, barely 17. Too young to shave, too young to kill. He was shaking, said he missed his dog. Said his mother made stew with cloves and garlic and he hated it, but now he would give anything for a spoonful. I wrote it down. He died 2 nights later, but his voice stayed. That's the thing about stories. They don't end when a heartbeat does. They echo, they comfort. They remind us that we were human, even when the world tried to erase it. In the final weeks of the war, when everything around us had turned to chaos, I lost that notebook. A fire, a blast, I don't know. One moment I had it, the next, it was ash. I wept for that more than I did for many comrades, because those voices, they were all I had left of them. But then one day, years later, I was walking through a market back home. A woman was telling her child a story about a man who had held on to hope, about a friend who read his final words to the one he loved. And I realized, stories don't die in flames, they live in the telling, in the remembering, in the voices we carry forward. War leaves scars, visible and invisible. But what about the scars carried by those who survived? What price do they pay to keep memories alive? And how far would you go to honor a promise made in the darkest moments? The story I'm about to tell you starts with a letter, the last letter. You might think it's just paper, ink, words folded into a small envelope, but sometimes a letter is everything. Imagine this, a young soldier, barely more than a boy, writing to his mother in a shaky hand. The front lines roar in the distance, but for a moment, there's quiet. A space carved out of chaos to pour out hope, fear, and love. His name was Thomas. He fought in the thickest part of the war, where the mud never dried and the air was thick, with smoke and despair. In his letters, Thomas never spoke of the battles, not directly. Instead, he described small things. The way the sun hit the trees, the sound of birds at dawn, the taste of stale bread. He wanted to shield his mother from the horrors. He wanted her to believe he was still the boy who loved to climb trees and play by the river, but behind those words was a growing shadow. Thomas was scared. scared of what the war was turning him into, scared of never seeing home again. One letter, written on a crumpled piece of paper, captured that fear better than any battle report. "I don't know if I'll make it back, Mama," he wrote, "but I promise if I fall, I'll find a way to tell you. You'll know I'm thinking of you. I'll send my last words like a whisper on the wind." It was a promise he carried until his final day. That day came suddenly. A shell exploded nearby. Thomas was caught in the blast. He didn't speak afterward, but the letter was never sent, and that's where the story takes a turn. Years after the war, his mother, Margaret, kept waiting for news. No letters, no messages, just silence. But Margaret was a woman of faith and fierce determination. She refused to let that silence define her son's story. She became an activist, helping families search for missing soldiers, pushing governments to reveal war records and collecting letters, diaries, and stories from veterans. Margaret's life became a testament to memory. She met survivors who carried their own ghosts, men and women whose minds were haunted by what they'd seen and what they'd lost. They told her about the letters they never sent, about the words they buried deep inside, words that screamed in silence. One of them was a man named Jack. He had been a medic. He carried wounded soldiers from the battlefield, sometimes risking his life to save strangers. Jack told Margaret about the last letter he had written to his wife, Anna. He never mailed it. He lost it in a firefight, but he remembered every word. He recited it to her one day during a reunion for veterans. The words were raw, desperate, and full of love. Anna listened, tears streaming down her face. "That letter," she said, "is the closest I have to him." Margaret realized something vital that day. These letters, real or remembered, were more than just words. They were bridges between the living and the dead, between the past and the future, between pain and healing. And it wasn't just about remembering the horrors, it was about remembering the humanity, because war tries to reduce men to numbers, to statistics. But these letters restored names, faces, voices, and with them, dignity. Margaret's crusade culminated in the creation of a memorial, not a monument with cold stone and empty plaques, but a living archive, a place where families could come, read letters, listen to recordings, see photos, a sanctuary of memory, and at its center was Thomas's last letter, found decades later tucked away in an old chest by a farmer who had discovered it buried beneath a collapsed barn near the old front lines. The paper was yellowed, fragile, but the words inside still held power. When Margaret finally held that letter in her hands, years of waiting, fear, and hope came rushing back. She read it aloud to the crowd gathered for the memorial's opening. "I don't know if I'll make it back, Mama," she said, voice trembling, "but I promise if I fall, I'll find a way to tell you. You'll know I'm thinking of you. I'll send my last words like a whisper on the wind." A hush fell over the crowd, and in that moment, the weight of history lifted a little. Because memory isn't just about the past, it's about what we do with it, the stories we tell, the voices we keep alive, and the promises we keep. But there is a deeper question beneath it all. How do we carry the burden of memory without being crushed by it? Margaret knew this all too well. For every letter recovered, there were thousands lost. For every story told, countless others remained buried in silence. The survivors, those who came home, often found themselves caught between worlds, haunted by what they'd seen, unable to explain it, trying to reconcile who they were before and after the war. This struggle was not just theirs alone. Families, communities, and nations bore the weight, too. How do you honor the past without being consumed by it? How do you grieve without losing hope? In the decades following the war, new generations asked these questions, and the answers were not easy. Some found solace in remembering, others in forgetting. But Margaret believed there was power in confronting memory head-on. That by sharing the stories, the good, the bad, the heartbreaking, we could heal. We could build a future that honors sacrifice without repeating mistakes. so she worked tirelessly to collect letters from every possible source: private collections, archives, even letters sold or traded in, flea markets. Each letter was a fragment of history, a window into a soul, and as these letters were gathered and read aloud, they revealed something extraordinary. Despite the horrors, despite the fear and loss, love persisted. Love for family, for country, for the small moments of humanity that war tried to erase. Thomas's letters, like many others, were filled with this love. They reminded people that soldiers were not just fighters. They were sons, brothers, friends, people who laughed, dreamed, and feared just like anyone else. This realization changed the way history was told. No longer just dates and battles, but human stories. Stories that demanded to be heard. And as these stories circulated, they inspired art, literature, and film. Reminders that war is never just a strategic event, it's personal. It touches lives in ways statistics can never show. So here's my final question for you. What would you do if you found an old letter from a soldier? Would you read it and feel their fear, their hope? Would you let it remind you that behind every war is a human story? Would you carry that story forward so it's never forgotten? Because these letters are more than paper and ink. They are echoes of the past, whispers of those who came before, and lessons for those who follow. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of memory and the strength of the human spirit, then please subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. And remember, every voice matters. Every story deserves to be told. Thank you for listening.